No. Hello and a warm good morning from Tamil Nadu, India. First of all, I would like to use this juncture to thank our audience, our viewers, because we have just crossed our first 1,000 subscribers for our YouTube channel, Literal Broadcast, and we are so happy about it. And we expect our audience to support us throughout our entire journey. And since this is the last live stream for the year 2020, I would like to address a few things. The year 2020 has gone past like a very bad omen because of the pandemic, and we have spent most of the year inside the lockdown, and there have been countless losses around the world. And judging from the way things are going, I think we will need another 3 to 4 years to recover from this particular year. But I would like to open this particular episode of Essential Reads with a quote from Tennyson. I came upon it when I was when I saw The Forester, a play by Tennyson, and there is this line called "Hope smiles from the threshold of the year to come, whispering it will be happier." And with that note, we are so excited to have a presidential inaugural poet here live with us all the way from the United States. And with nothing further to add, I would like to ask Mr. Karthikeyan, one of the content developers at Literal, to give a brief introduction about our guest here.
Thank you, Prem. Richard Blanco is an American poet, an inaugural poet, a public speaker, and a civil engineer. He is the fifth poet to read at an US presidential inauguration. He read his original poem, One Today, at Barack Obama's second presidential inauguration. His poetry collections include How to Love a Country, which was published in 2019, City of 100 Fires, published in 1998, Directions to the Beach of the Dead, published in 2005. He has won numerous awards for his poetry, and a few of them include Agnes Starrett Poetry Prize, Paterson Poetry Prize, and Thom Gunn Award. He has a passion to teach poetry, and his belief is that he wants to demystify poetry to ages 8 to 88. He remains as the first education ambassador for the Academy of American Poets. His family, including his parents, were exiles from Cuba, and his family immigrated to New York City. He was born, raised, and educated in Miami. In his poetry, he explores ideas such as being a Cuban American, Cuban heritage, cultural identity, and the meaning of home. 2020 may have been a bad year, but I believe that the winter has come and passed, and the spring is yet to come in the year 2021. With those words, I hand over the session to Sashikala ma'am. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Literary welcomes you all for its second episode of Essential Reads, which focuses on interviews with eminent writers. And today, we have with us an illustrious poet from USA, Mr. Richard Blanco. Welcome, Richard.
Well, hi everyone. My apologies for being late, but the time change got me all confused, and I thought this was going to be my Sunday night, but here we are. Hopefully, just lovely to be here and have a great time and a meaningful time with all of you.
It's definitely going to be a pleasurable event on our side, for you have made it a point to stay with us late night, and that too during a weekend. So it's really a great moment for all of us who are gathered here. Richard, can we straight away go with the questions, because we have a very short period of time, and moreover, it's late night on your part.
I'm a night owl, as we say, so it's okay.
Okay, so moving on to the first question. Art and literature have always played an integral part in shaping the history of a civilization. The inclusion of poetry at the presidential inauguration in USA is something fantastic. How did you feel as the youngest person to be the US inaugural poet in Barack Obama's second inauguration? What was your experience?
Sure. Well, it was an amazing experience, needless to say. But I think what was most powerful, besides meeting Beyonce, who sang the national anthem, I've not all my life, even at that age, I was 44 when that happened. I really wasn't exactly convinced 100% that I was American. I didn't, being Cuban, being in exile, I just wasn't, I wasn't sure that my story sort of belonged to the American story. I thought it had to be some white guy in some other neighborhood with another kind of family. So that moment just really gave me a really important sense of realizing that in a democracy that everybody's story sort of matters, and that part of my story is part of this democracy, but also the honor of representing so many people that didn't feel quite American as well, that didn't feel like they were like the people on TV or the TV shows or the TV commercials, So I think that was what was most, that was the greatest gift of the inauguration, was in a way to realize that that I belong to this country, that my story is part of the story of the United States and part of the story of a democracy. And like our motto says in America, in the United States, is out of the many one, and realizing that that was a moment where I was being included as one of those one people. I mean, honestly, we're not there yet as a country. We're still fighting to get to that ideal. And that was the other important thing I realized, was that a democracy is a work in progress, just like a poem, just like a novel, just like anything that we try in life, and that it involves us participating in it to keep on working on it. And so that was an important realization too. And plus, I mean, I'm just, I was just this working class immigrant kid, and to stand in front of the whole nation was just an amazing experience.
So, with that experience shared by you, the process of acculturation seems simple in concept, but it's rather very difficult in practice. You grew up in America, but had your roots in Cuba. What does Cuban American mean to you in the context of your acculturation? Did this experience contribute to your writing of poetry?
Yeah, great question. So, as I like to say, I lived between two imaginary worlds when I was growing up. One was this Cuba of my parents and my grandparents in Miami and the whole community, this place that I belonged to, that was my homeland, but I had never been there. So it felt very real because everybody was Cuban. My classmates were Cuban American like me, and so that was important. But then there was a fictional, which kind of relates to my answer to the last question. There was this other imaginary world, which was this United States that I saw on TV, and that narrative. But that wasn't my community. That wasn't my home life. That wasn't the people in my school. So from a very young age, I always had to navigate between these two real imaginary worlds and trying to understand what I belong, what is home, what is identity. And so it just became essential to my work. When I start writing at 27 years old, I'm not thinking about this when I'm 5 years old, but it's happening, right? So that's important. And I think that poetry was a way to investigate that. And why I say that, it's when I started writing poetry that I realized that I had all these questions that I didn't realize that I had, but it wasn't conscious of them. I didn't realize that I had that there was a deep questioning. So my poetry allowed me to go back through my life and think about all those questions that I never asked, but they were there still, right? But in particular, culturally, this is something interesting. As the second part of your question was that, I think in most countries, most countries outside of the United States, poetry has a different space in society. Certainly in Latin American countries and in the Caribbean countries, poetry is just part of the folklore. It's part of the storytelling. It's part of how, not everybody is, an avid poetry reader, but we're certainly not scared of poetry. So I grew up with my mother sort of thinking, she would quote Jose Marti, and she would recite a poem. She used to write little poems for her when there was a birthday or a new baby. She would write a poem. It's just kind of something natural. And I imagine in India too. I've been to international poetry festivals, and it's amazing how poetry is embraced and thought about very differently. So I think that affected my sense of what poetry is, and what I want poetry to do in the world is to connect with people and to connect people to each other and be part of a folklore, be part of something that grows community, be part of something that creates dialogue, conversation, discourse. And I guess the other reason why I even became a poet in the first place was I just realized that the other day, why I became a poet, because I'm a civil engineer, right? I didn't start writing poetry till I was 27. I never remember not knowing two languages I can't remember not knowing Spanish and English. And I remember as a little kid, as a child, translating for my parents at 2, 3, 4 years old, not whole conversations, but small words or phrases. And I think there was a fascination with language that was born in me because I knew language was power. I also knew language was not just a way of communicating, but a way of thinking about the world. The idea that my parents lived in this world that was Spanish, that spoke only Spanish, and I lived in this other world that was understood English, and being that kind of bridge between them. And so I think I was born with that kind of fascination. That early childhood experience fascinated me. And when it came time to express myself creatively, I think I turned to language and to poetry for those reasons.
That's great indeed. Being a civil engineer, you would have mastered yourself in buildings, being an architect of your buildings, but you have chiseled almost all your poems, and that has brought the literary architect in you. That's great. Writing poetry involves a lot of rumination and thought process. This involves a lot of emotions on your part. Do all these exactly energize you, or they drain you out?
I'm sorry, does what energize me?
Your concept of the process of writing poetry. Does it energize you, or you feel drained out after you compose a poem?
I think a poem goes through stages. And I think each one of them is met with a distinct emotion or reaction. So it's kind of like, like a butterfly. It goes through different stages. In the very beginning, it's draining because when you just first start writing, right, you're like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I want to show you. I started a poem this week. I don't know what I'm doing. It's just a mess. I'm just trying to get words on paper. It's so frustrating. I go to bed every night like frustrated and like thinking I'm not even I'm a terrible poet. But I've learned over the years to trust that that's part of the process. Then there's the second phase is when you have that moment where there's a sense of language is opening a door to some kind of understanding, or cracking open a door, and then the poem starts almost writing itself, right? That's very thrilling. And then there's a moment in a poem where I discover something that I didn't know before. Often we enter a poem thinking we feel a certain thing, and in the process of the art, there's this wonderful discovery because we are making art at the end of the day. And that's a moment of great thrill because I feel I learned something new about myself, about the world, about my mother, about my community, about my country, whatever it is, because I gave myself to the art. So there's a period of frustration, a period of creativity, a period of revelation that's very energizing. And then there's a period of, I don't know if there's the right word for it, but a period of giving. A period where you give the poem to the world, and after it's done, almost done, where you start sharing it with people, and that where it's your gift to the world, and it's kind of that's another beautiful feeling too when people come back to you and tell you, that poem that I read made me feel like this, or reminded me of that, and that's another sort of great emotion, a sense of gratitude of people sharing their stories. So it's kind of a roller coaster. And then there's a little bit of sadness sometimes when you have to when that poem becomes, it's like a child, that poem becomes its own thing in the world, and it does what it needs to do, and you're like, you have to let it go. And so there's all sorts of, and that's what I love about it. You go through a really great range of emotions. But at the end of the day, to answer your question, poetry, why I'm addicted to writing poetry is because of that discovery, because of that moment that I feel when I finish a poem, I'm a little bit wiser, a little bit more loving, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more angry, a little bit more, whatever that case may be with that poem. As I always like to say, my poems are smarter than me. They teach me something, and that's ultimately what keeps me writing, right?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, writing of your poems have made you what you are today. Constantly developing yourself, growing with the poems, actually.
Yeah. It's really interesting because sometimes I'll look back at a poem that I wrote and realize that I was thinking about something years ago that I'm only sort of now completely conscious of. So like they're just kind of like, they're the truest part of the self. And it's kind of like a mirror. You start seeing another part of yourself in a different way, in a reflection that's your better self, your wiser self, your truer self. That's the beauty of art in general, right?
Yeah. And you would not have become what you are today overnight, because getting to the top is not that very easy. It involves a lot of effort and struggle. You, now being a successful poet, can you just tell us if you have ever undergone the pain of your work being rejected?
Oh my gosh, of course. Who hasn't, right? Like, I guess this is one of the things we have to always keep on remembering. Even so, yeah, of course, I've gotten rejected. I was even rejected from the first time I applied to graduate school for creative writing. I was rejected. Like, even that, I was rejected, and I almost gave up. I was like, never mind. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I don't want to. Being a poet, what am I thinking? But yeah, that's just part of the process. But then there's also the times you get your poetry gets accepted, and so that's important too, to remember those moments. So yeah, it's just I don't send out poems so much now, because there's an irony now that I've achieved a certain amount of success. I also feel like it's worse than ever. I can't get rejected. I'm terrified. I'm more terrified now than before. But also that since more people read me, that I don't want to put out a poem that's okay. I feel like this pressure now that the poem has to be really good, or else I won't publish. I'll hold back from publishing. So I think it's just a constant. It's part of. It comes with the job description, so to speak. It's something that we have to always do. But I think what's great about trying to get published, having your work out there, is that it also lets us know which of our poems are our better poems, and so we build on that. Right? We build. Okay, this poem got accepted publication here. What did I do in this poem that I can keep on doing in new poems? So it's a way of vetting our poetry. Also, it's kind of like, I feel like publishing is kind of, in a way, somewhat of workshopping your poems. You send them out. Sometimes you don't get accepted, but you'll get a note from the editor or something saying, we really like this. Maybe if you change this. So, but yeah, I'm like, I have gotten rejected plenty of times, more than, yeah.
Many of the audience who have gathered today, maybe they are budding poets. They would feel really motivated and spurred on knowing that even Blanco's Richard's poems were rejected once, and now you are what you are because of your efforts. That's going to be real motivation for our viewers. And did you always have ambitions to be a poet? You told that you became a poet only when you were 27 years old. But what was the moment that made you realize the poet in you? Was it anything significant? Was it any significant incident that made you realize the poet in you?
Yeah, there were a couple. One when I was in high school. So I was pretty senior, pretty young. I was never thinking about writing or anything like that. Part of becoming an engineer was also, I was great at math, and so that helped. But also being an immigrant, working class, the value, it was kind of like doctor, lawyer, engineer. You all can probably relate, right? Like, the arts is not something that, I think pretty much globally, the arts is not something parents usually want their children to go into. But especially, I had to survive financially. So poetry was something that I had very little access to. Didn't really understand it. I went to a Catholic private school, so like we didn't get a lot of arts. We got a lot of religion, but not a lot of arts. And then so yeah, I was very vague on my sense of what poetry was, at least American poetry. But there was two moments. One in high school was I remember reading by myself, because we had a substitute teacher, and the teacher said, just take out your textbook and write about a story or a poem. And so I just picked the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock to read. And that's not an easy poem, but there was something magical happened when it was just the poem and me, not the poem and the instructor. It was just the poem and me. Those last lines, that's about the mermaids. I hear the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they sing to me. and something touched my very soul, my very essence, that stayed with me for years. I still wasn't writing poetry, but it kind of stayed with me. And I wrote this whole paper on it, and I got an A, and I never got an A in English. English was like a B plus subject for me. And then there was a moment as an adult when I had started to write poetry. I had just started to write poetry, like really bad poetry. I was just starting to explore poetry, and I was reading. So I went back to some of the other poems that I remember from high school, and there's a famous little poem by William Carlos Williams. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow, and it goes, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chickens. Very haiku-ish. And I was reading this poem, and I'm looking at my mother in the kitchen cooking, like she's cooked all her, like, what, forever, 5 o'clock, dinner on the table, the whole family cooking in the same old apron that I remember her, the tomato stains, the big black pots, her olive oil, her knives, her old knives. And I just thought, that's poetry. So I'm reading this poem about the red wheelbarrow, a very simple poem. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow. And I thought, so much depends upon my mother in her apron, cooking arroz con pollo, because the whole world comes down to that, to the simplest moments in our lives. And it became a personal, it's like kind of when I was like, okay, I'm going to do this poetry thing. I'm going to go for it. It's something changed in me almost physiologically. And it became kind of a personal definition for me of poetry, which is poetry for me, or what I try to do in poetry, is to find the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary moments of our lives and try to pull those up and elevate them and realize the beauty in the simplest gestures and the moments that we take for granted. And I think to this day, my poetry still comes from that moment, from that very quiet but very powerful moment.
So, a man who is has been so fond of Max and who has always scored B with his English language, English papers, and today you're playing and having fun with words. That's really a very great inspiration for the growing up poets, the budding poets. And can you share a few words about your third book of poetry, Looking for the Gulf Motel, which received the Paterson Poetry Prize, the 2012 Main Literary Award for Poetry, and the Thom Gunn Award? A few words about it, please, Richard.
About the awards?
About the moment the awards were announced, or how you felt while composing it, what made you write it, a few words about it. The awards, as well as the composing of the poem as such.
Sure. I'm sorry, there's a little echo about the poems in particular, or the inaugural poem, or
Sorry, I didn't get you.
Oh, I didn't understand. I understood that you mentioned the prizes, but
yeah, it's for your third book of poetry, Looking for the Gulf Motel.
Right. And you wanted me to share.
Yeah, you have received so many awards for that.
I'm sorry. Sorry, the echo got bad again.
Okay.
Yeah, looking for the Gulf Motel, and you'd like me to answer what?
Yeah, a few words about that book.
Oh, about the book. Okay.
Yeah.
Simple enough. I thought it was a much more complicated question. That book was the third book. As they say, I don't know who said it or if I said it, but I say this of myself. A poet is writing one poem all their life. And what that means is that in some ways, there's something really, really important that happens in our life, usually that affects our subconscious. And the rest of our body of work is in a way trying to address that moment, question that moment, find answers for those questions, ask new questions. And for me, it comes down to that essence of home. What is home? From the day I was born, that was complicated. So looking for the Gulf Motel was an extension of that same question, except in there, I am a little bit more not questioning so much my own identity, but really just thinking more broadly about what is home, how do people respond to that, what is history, and so I'm just thinking it's still the same idea, of memory and place and how that all sort of fits together. It's also a poem. In that poem, I also, for the first time, started thinking about. So I think I was in my 40s, and there's a whole section in that book about mortality, right? Because this is something, our final home, our final resting place. And so that was a new kind of question about home, too. It was kind of like, well, what is home? And if we leave this all behind, how is that affecting my wanting to hold on to some kind of place or identity? So that was new in that book. And that was an interesting, it's kind of the same theme when we write, but it just keeps on growing in a different direction. So that book had that sort of, it was a new thing for me in that book.
So it's about the home and your memories.
Yeah, and what is, and the idea that, is home nothing but memory, really? Is that the only home we really have, right? So when you think about, the idea of an imaginary homeland, or if you think about, where, what is home, really? But I wasn't thinking so much about being Cuban or American or what that meant, but just what is more the essence of, how do we know what home is, right? Everything changes and is constantly changing. So then, is there ever really a home? So yeah, the questions got a little more complicated in that book. A little more, I guess, because I was older and a little more mature, much more mature, and so the writing became a little more complex or complicated, I should say.
Yeah. And poets, they have various reasons to write. Maybe to satisfy their ego, to impress or to attract. At times it works as a kind of a therapy, some as a career, and some for even spiritual revelation. What do you think is the purpose of your poetry writing?
Sure. Maybe a combination, a combination of all those three, I think. But I think one outweighs the other. I think for me, the spiritual dimension of it. I think when I write poetry, I transform. I'm not Richard Blanco anymore. I am connected to the eternal, to the divine. It's almost religious in that sense. I mean, I have my. I light my candle before I start writing. I put on my my sort of music, not pop music or anything like that, just meditative music. And to me, that is the ultimate reason I keep on writing. There's a sense of, it's almost like a religious practice. It's almost like meditation in a way. And it's about the letting, in a weird way. Well, I should say this. I think, like I tell my students a lot, writing a poem is one of the most arrogant, selfish, idiotic things you could do in the world. Because in some ways, right, the poem has to begin with ego. It has to say, my experience, I just saw this beautiful thing, and it's so valuable that I need to set it to paper, right? So there's kind of a spiritual ego at that moment. But then it's also, like I was saying earlier, it's also a letting go of that. And it's also that becomes a gift to someone else, right? So it's also, writing a poem is also one of the most generous, egoless, selfless things that one can do in the world, is to offer that experience and make art out of it and give it away, right? And so But in some ways, it does begin with this egoic sense of my life. I'm so hyper focused on my experiences. Oh, my conflicts, my losses, but in a weird way, for me, poetry is a process of transcending the very things that bring us to the page. It's about transcending your own story so that they become someone else's. And so in that sense, to me, it's like prayer, like or praise or whatnot. I feel transformed every time I write a poem a little bit, and I feel like when you're really writing a poem is probably getting completely away from the ego. But then again, then you send out the poem, then you publish a book, and then your ego comes back in because you want the book to win prizes, and you want so it's called being human, right?
Yeah.
But I know what you're saying. Like the motivation, ultimately, the ego doesn't sustain much motivation because, you get published, and then the minute you get published, you're worried about the next time you're going to get published, or the minute you win an award, there's always another award, right? Like, so, I read a poem to 40 million people and to the entire United States. And then I'm like, what's next? The Nobel Prize. It's like the ego is just part of being human. Yeah, but that's not what keeps me. That's not what keeps me going. I mean, we all want a certain measure of success, right? It feels good to be validated. I should say that's part of being human, and I think that's perfectly fine. You should try to get published. You should try to win awards. You just can't build a career around it, and that's not what's going to make me sit at my desk and write the next poem. It's not an award. It's actually just why I came to poetry in the first place. And I always try to remember that, like why I came to poetry before all this before the ego came to mind. William Blake's had noted that, right, that the child is the perfect creator because there is no ego. It's just pure play. And even when I begin a poem, the ego is somewhat involved because I want to write a good poem. And then, of course, the minute I let go of that and say, you know what, I may not be able to write this poem. It's okay. Just let it go. As soon as I say goodbye to the ego, the poem starts opening up to me. Right?
So you begin with your ego, and then it involves a selfless ego, and then you end up with ego. You cannot call it actually egoistic because it's just keeping up the mark, standing with the quality that you have produced, and you need to satisfy the expectations of your readers, and that makes you a perfect poet in a way.
Yeah, it starts right, like now. Yeah, it's like the danger of the ego is even more now, right? Because it's like you have again. It's ironic. So I remember. When my very first book that I got published, when I heard the news, it was through the phone call. You can imagine how excited I was, right? In my very first book, I won a contest in America. For the most part, the way you publish a book of poetry is through a contest because it's the United States. They're not such great readers of poetry all the time. But anyway, I run to the bookstore and I go see where my book will be in the bookstore shelf in the poetry section, and I would be next to Blake, next to William Blake. And I was like, my ego was high for like an hour, and then I just realized I got a lot more work to do. Here's this person, still speaking to us after centuries, and I just won my first book award. Gee, big deal.
Richard, actually, you had assured us a 30 minutes time for interview. It's almost 25 minutes now. Can I go with a couple of questions, or shall we move on to the Q&A session?
Let's do one more question. That would be great. This is fun.
Okay, thank you so much. The modern world has so many sources of entertainment. Does poetry have its place in the new world as a source of delight?
In the United States or in the world in general?
In the world.
That's a very interesting source of delight. I'd love that. It's interesting. I don't know about the world because I have traveled, but usually when I travel, I don't want to be a poet. I just want to drink martinis. But I have noticed something fascinating in my own lifetime and what's happening, at least in the United States, how um, again, and it gets to maybe a cultural element that we talked about, like how poetry is perceived in other cultures in a much more uh, public way, in a much more in community. And in America, in the United States, we always had something, the spoken word poets, the performance poets, and they were like kind of a little shunned upon when I was going to school in like the 90s, right? That was too pedestrian. That was too, and yet they seem to have carried the oral tradition of poetry. And what I love that's happening right now in the United States is that, yeah, in a sense, it's becoming much more popular because the infusion of spoken word and of performance has really enlivened poetry. And then technology. There's these amazing poetry animations that people are making. Well, even the idea that you can watch you like a poet, you can watch them perform on YouTube right away, right? You don't have to wait. And so it has become, I know my students who are not who are not writers, are in my literature courses and in my other courses are really into like up to speed with poets, and are really, it's kind of hip. Like they're like cool, and they have their favorites and they battle. So I think it's becoming, when you think about what poetry was, right? It was a source of delight. It was the song of the village, right? It was the village voice. It was a way for us to come together and talk. And so I think that in a way is happening in a really pretty way. So the academy is sort of embracing, or I should say the spoken word oral tradition is merging with the academic tradition. And I think so a lot of these spoken word poets are now professors. And I think that's really exciting. How that has come back, the idea that poetry is delight, it's performance, it's song. I mean, at the end of the day, I think poetry is closer to song, to music, than to, I gotta say, in some ways, poetry, might be better taught with music and drama and art, when visual arts, because what is a poem and a novel don't have a lot in common other than words. They come from a different space. They come from a different tradition. Poetry is, at the end of the day, it's song. It makes us feel the way music makes us feel, and it touches our subconscious in ways that we're not even aware of sometimes. Like sometimes we have our favorite poems and we don't even know why. It's like a song. Like, don't always need to know what it means. You just know that it means in you, right? I always think about T.S. Eliot that way. Some of my favorite poems are T.S. Eliot. I mean, not T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings. I have no idea what some of E.E. Cummings' poems are saying, but I just read them out loud and they make me cry. And I'm just like song, It's just like, it's a moving experience.
Actually, for people who are illiterate, maybe music provides that. For people who could really enjoy reading, it's poetry.
Yeah.
Right? So It was so nice having you with us. Questions from Shashikla's side is over. From Vitriol Banner, it's over. And we'll be happy if you could read some of your favorite lines. The viewers and ourselves, we would be much pleased and happy about it.
Sure. Just lines from different poems, right?
Yeah.
Great. I've never been asked to do that. That's really fun. There's this poem, and it's interesting because I think sometimes poems happen because you hear a line, right? And like that line almost inspires the whole poem. This is certainly true of this poem, and I'll read you the line that repeats. It's become somewhat of a refrain. The poem is called Mother Country, and this was the White House asked me to write 3 poems for the inauguration. I'd read one today, but this was the one that they did, one of the 2 that they didn't use. And this line came to me. This is thinking about my mother and her leaving Cuba, her exile, her immigration. she was 7 months pregnant with me. Like I can't imagine that kind of how she was able to leave Cuba and know that, you know, at that time the understanding was that you would never be able to come back. You know, you're in exile, you're thrown out, you're out of the country. So this line came to me. It's like, to love a country as if you've lost one. And that sense of like, I thought, you know, when we live in our country, like even I take a lot of America, United States for granted. But, you know, the idea of looking at a country through an immigrant's eyes who has come to the United States seeking some kind of ideal or whatnot. And I just think, you know, in some ways, the United States is very spoiled because they've never had to. Well, we're close these days to losing a country. I mean, this is unprecedented, right? Like, but, you know, I have my history from my mother and revolutions and dictators. And I think, you know, that's probably the more common experience around the world than. Yeah, I mean, really, it's mostly the echo, but
Excuse me, everyone. I'm really sorry to interrupt again. I think we could go live right now.
Yes, Richard, you can start with the reciting of your poem, the lines, your favorite lines.
Sure.
The same emotions.
Again, yeah. This is the one of from the Gulf Motel, and it deals with the Gulf Motel was this place that we used to go since I was a kid, a vacation place, very cheap. And I went back as an adult trying to find this place again, and I couldn't. And so this is a memory of what I remember in the Gulf Motel, which is a poem, but it's also the title of the book that we were talking about, right? And it says, "There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear, 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea. And the stars should still be turning around them."
What an experience for us you have given right now to listen to your own lines with your own emotions. This is something rare for us from your side, for we have never heard the poetry lines being read by the poet himself. It's something, a dream come true for almost all of us here. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's almost midnight there, and still your enthusiasm is soaring high. You've got yourself lost in your poem again, reading those lines to us. I think you have almost relived those moments while reading it to us.
Yeah, that's what happens. I've read that poem God knows how many times, and it's like song, you know, when you sing a song, you just get right back into that emotion. It's so much like that. Like, how many times have we heard our favorite song, and every time it comes on the radio or we play it at home, we're like, we get into it, right? It's no matter how many. It's really interesting because like one rarely reads a memoir like twice or three times, or a novel. You read a novel, pretty much you're done, you put it away. But how many times do we read our favorite poems? It's just like music. We can hear them over and over again. And for me, as the poet, I relive that moment too. It's very powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. As music is a healer, so is poetry.
Yeah,
right?
Very related.
Yeah, and now to the questions from our valuable viewers. We have a question from DK Agatya. Her question is, do you feel the modern poetry has to confine to the various construct types such as sonnet or Shakespearean structure to make it an acceptable one or a publishable one?
Sure. I mean, I think in the United States, I think it's certainly not. It's interesting because sort of that's where our literary tradition comes from. But America has continued to experiment so much. I mean, we have, for instance, the birth of Whitman, right? Like, it's just totally going contrary to tradition in some ways. And I think that still here continues. One of the most popular things now that people are exploring is what we call a hybrid poem, and it's just kind of taking a excerpt from Wikipedia and writing a piece of poem, and then taking something from a magazine article. So it's all that. By that same token, I think that in some ways, some of those traditional rhetorical modes still inform our poetry, but not strictly as a form. But the idea that for example, I relate my poetry back to, I sort of feel like a belated romantic poet. I feel like a Wordsworth, or I feel like that's part of my tradition in some way, because the idea that the personal I is the way towards objective truth, right? Through this objective experience of the self. So I think we have tradition, but certainly in the publishing world, I think it's quite the opposite here. The more crazy stuff you write, the more you likely. In fact, I'm probably too traditional, too like narrative for some publications. They think they love like just stuff that's really breaks tradition. So,
thank you. I think Agatya has got her query answered, and she has set her pen to start writing. Right, and now we have another question from another viewer called Smart English. If poetry is the expression of personal feelings, how to make it impersonal, as according to T.S. Eliot, in his theory of a catalyst, that mind of the poet is a shred of the platinum. It's from Arun Ketkar.
No, that's interesting. So, I think it was kind of like a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. The process of depersonal, I would say, of objectifying your life is almost necessary in the art to achieve a truth that you didn't even know, or a discovery that you didn't know. I mean, that's the way I look at it. Again, I think I date myself more, or thinking more about the Romantics and about and Wordsworth, and the idea of it's a spontaneous overflow of feelings collected in quiet tranquility, and the idea that a poem is not just but that it's then taking that energy, and I think it's almost necessary. How we get there is because if we put the art first, and that's kind of one of the hardest things I have to sort of contend with in a classroom, is to let them know that yes, it begins with this energy, but we're also making art, right? So that you have to, it's the art that ultimately, I wouldn't say depersonalizes it, but objectifies it, so that you can look at yourself and actually learn something more important than if you just would stay in your moment. I'll give you an example. That poem that I just read about, the excerpt that I read about the Gulf Motel, the first draft of that poem, when I went back and couldn't find this place, the city had been overgrown, like it was unrecognizable. I was angry. I wrote this horrible, angry poem. I was like vitriol. I was like spitting on the page. I was just angry and like upset and like, how dare they? And then it took me like 3 months of working on the poem and finally realizing I wasn't angry. I was frightened. I was for the first time realizing back then my mortality, and the idea that the lack of human agency, that things change and the world doesn't need your permission. And at the same time, I realized, even though that building isn't there, the motel isn't there, nobody can take my memories. So it was both a positive and a negative reaction. And I didn't realize the beauty of the Gulf Motel until I lost it. And so the struggle with the poem and objectifying my life made me realize all these things that if I would have just stayed in my anger, I would have just stayed in my anger. But we're making art, and art demands certain things. So, and one of the things it demands is for you to a certain degree transcend or objectify your life. And in that way, it can be somewhat therapeutic, but not therapy, because I don't think it's therapy. Therapy is a lot more expensive. But it's in therapy, you try to take a step back from your life and look at it a little bit more from a distance. And I think that poetry, and when you do that, you also allow the reader to come in. And I think that's part of what's important, right?
I think Arun Ketkar would be really excited with your elaborate answer for his question. Can I go for a couple of questions, Richard, or is it too late on your side?
Sure. Yeah, let's do two more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question from TK. Is poetry subjective or objective?
Oh, great question. God, we never get these kinds of questions in the United States. Like, do you use a computer or paper? Like, these are really great questions. Subjective or objective? So I think, obviously, when we talk about reading, I think there's a level of subjectivity to anything, right? I think there is, a level of taste when we're reading poetry. And I imagine the question meant as a reader or as a writer or both. I don't know. But as a reader, and when we teach poetry, what do we say, what's good, what's bad? I always try to contextualize it in a different way. I try to tell my students to always think about what is the poem trying to achieve, and is it being successful in what it sets out to achieve? So it's very difficult to say, I can't compare E.E. Cummings with William Blake, and I can't compare William Blake with T.S. Eliot, right? So the idea being that the idea is like trying to understand and appreciate the poem for what it is trying to do. So E. Cummings for me is a musical poet, right? It's all about sounds and so is it successful in doing that? And I can say, yes, that's a good poem because blah, blah, blah. Now, do I like the poem is a whole other story, right? I personally love E. Cummings, but there's a lot of more language poets that are experimental, and I can appreciate them. Is it what I go to? Is it the stuff that really moves me? No. But I think in all art, there is a certain level of objectivity. Let's face it. We can say that a poem, after a certain level that meets certain sort of requirement or certain standards of the art, but below that, I think we can be completely objective that what bad poems are. Oh, I should say poems that are not quite there yet. So, and that's fine. I mean, I've written those horrible poems. The roses are red, violets are blue. We can definitely say, I think, unanimously that is not where poetry needs to be, right? When you use cliches in a poem, my heart is broken. Okay, terrible. So I think there's a certain baseline where we can say, okay, everything above that we can say is accomplished. Then within that, what is subjective? There's still a subjective element to it because there just is, and it's larger than any one person. I think the arts go through, they go through phases, right? They go through like fads, if you will. I remember there was a time in the United States where like everybody had like an angel in their poem. If you didn't have an angel in the poem, you weren't writing poetry. Right? That's the angel this and all sorts of metaphors about angels and angels. Nobody writes about angels anymore. Or like we've shifted a lot between narrative and lyrical poets in the United States too, and thinking about sometimes narrative poetry sort of earns a higher esteem. Sometimes the lyrical poets or the experimental poets hold this higher esteem. Right now, we're in a phase where we're appreciating more, like I said earlier, the spoken word, the poetry that has more of the street sort of flavor to it, and so that's sort of seen differently. But I think as long as we're having a conversation about it, that's the most important thing. And asking these questions, that's art is a constant dialogue. As I like to say, my students, good art answers questions. Great art keeps on asking them. So keep on asking those questions, right?
That would have been a wonderful answer for TK. And here we have Sayan. The question is, M.H. Abrams tells in The Dimension of Poetry that every poet has 4 sides to one poem. Will you agree to it, or you will disagree and say that there is just one emotion related to it?
Oh, I think I understood that. What was the first part that we have access to? I think. Let me read back the question. That I think what they were asking was that if there's like one emotion that everyone is supposed to feel, or if people can feel different things, and if that's right or wrong.
Actually, she has mentioned a particular writer, M.H. Abrams, and he has defined it like there are 4 dimensions of poetry, whereas is it just one emotion which results in the writing of poem? Is it one strong emotion that makes you compose a poem, or you have 4 dimensions?
I don't know the exact what the reference is, but I will say I think the best poetry and the poetry that I like, the pieces that I consider the best poetry, are the most, and the poems that I think are my best, most successful, are the ones that examine a complexity of emotions. So, human existence is contradictory by nature. Like, we're fickle animals. We're like happy and sad at the same time. And I think that a poem that examines those intersections and complexities is where ultimately I think the truer to life poem. And I think we can say that it's sometimes those poems that are one-dimensional that actually aren't that successful. Again, my example of the Gulf Motel, when I first wrote that poem, I just was like angry. That's all I had. Angry. And then as I wrote more, I realized part of it was anger, part of it was fear, part of it was joy. Part of it was gratitude of realizing that all my life I had this special place that had all these memories that I didn't appreciate when they were happening, but I can appreciate now because it's not here anymore. That's complex. And so I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling mortal and realizing I'm a mortal being. And yet there's a great freedom in accepting that and saying, yeah, I will die. There's a kind of relief in that too. So I would say 4. I would say like maybe 8 or 10 dimensions. I think that's when a poem really starts to shine, is when it starts looking at that. And I think for me also, that's when I make that discovery. That's when the poem comes alive for me, because I'm like, it isn't just one thing that I came in with, but rather I realize so much more is happening in my soul, in my heart, and in my mind that the poem has revealed to me. And I think that then that's revealed to the reader in a way too, that discovery.
Maybe the spark is hit with a single strong emotion, but as you start penning it, it turns multidimensional.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just an emotion. You don't even know what it is. You're just like something like sometimes I'm just like driving and I just start crying or I start laughing out loud because I remember something my grandfather said, or and it's just sometimes just this. It sometimes isn't, it's sometimes even just this overpowering. Sometimes it's just like something really sweet that you remember about a gesture your grandmother made, or and it's poetry because I think it's poetry because I think there's something there to investigate through the art. But for me, a poem begins, and it's kind of the way I know whether I'm going to write. So I've written a couple memoirs. And I think that's when I've learned more or less to think, is it a poem or a story? If I'm feeling something that I have no exact idea what it is yet, I know it's a poem. If I'm thinking about something and saying, and I have a narrative and thinking, I really want to say this, I really want to write this, then I realize that's prose. It's like kind of something else. It's not I kind of know too much already. So it's probably prose, right? It's not just a mess in my head of like, you know, there's no story in my head. It's just, well, again, it's like song, right? Like in the same way that we feel when we hear a song that really touches us. I think it's the same feeling when when we're writing a poem, that we're overcome with this thing, this urgency, this element. And again, it's not always, sometimes it can be very subtle, but yet powerful. It's not always like, oh my God. It's not always that. Sometimes it's this quiet moment of revelation that comes to you like, I'll give you a really silly example. Like in the brand new book, there's a poem called My Father Indeed. And I've carried this all my life, but until it comes ready to come out, my dad barely learned English, but he went to night school and he would always use the word indeed because he thought if he put indeed in there, he would sound smarter. So, but he would totally misuse the word all the time. So he'd be like they asked him, would you like more coffee? And he'd say, indeed. And then he would ask me, he didn't really know what the word meant or how to use it. But I remember he asked me once, like, what's this indeed mean? I was like, I don't know. I knew English, but I was not a second language. So I didn't know what part of speech it was. Like, Dad, I don't know. It's just a word. Like, stop using it so much. And that stayed with me. And one day, something about someone said, indeed, somewhere, and I just started crying. And that's a poem. But it wasn't ready yet, right? It was just like, my dad obviously passed away when I was 23 years old. So it was this little bit of language that his ghost just came to me in that moment. And I was like, why have I never written about this? This is a poem. and I wrote the poem like it was one of those poems, not one of the very exception, but it was a fairly quickly written poem because it had been brewing in me since 10 years old. In some ways, it had been with me since 10 years old. So I forgot the question, but I think that's part of the question. Having a little fun here.
It was all related to emotions, and you have depicted. You have been living the moment right now. Yeah. You have been yourself. It was so nice having you with us. It's 11:30 here in India, but it's almost 12:30 there for you. The middle of the night. The middle of the night, you are so energetic, enthusiastic, not a bit tired. It's because it's your cup of tea. It's poetry.
Yeah.
Right?
Now I'm gonna have to have a drink now to calm down. that's so like obviously I was already sleepy, but now I'm so on it. Okay. I got class tomorrow too. Workshop I'm teaching at 9. So it's been it's been a pleasure. I knew it would be. I felt it would be. But also, again, I want to apologize to everyone because I thought I was going to do this tomorrow night. I thought you didn't realize, but I think it's as they say, all's well that ends well, and everything is meant to be. So thank you so much, everyone, and hope to visit your country someday. I have never been, so one of these days when all this is over, right?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. You made this episode. You ended this episode on a high note. It's really fantastic having had you with us. It's an unforgettable moment for Litreal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers. Thank you for joining us. It's
my pleasure.
Signing off from Litreal.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.